Hello. In the Second World War, a new way of conducting offensive operations struck the European theater like a lightning bolt. It was the Blitzkrieg, and with it, from 1939 to mid-1941, the German armed forces achieved enormous tactical, operational, and strategic victories. But then, first in late 1941, and then in 1942, the Blitzkrieg did not achieve the desired strategic victories. First, it was repulsed before Moscow, and then defeated at Stalingrad. But after the disaster at Stalingrad, the Germans reorganized their armies and in the summer of 1943 unleashed them once again. It was Operation Citadel, launched against the Kursk salient, which seemed as an ideal target, as it was only 125 miles wide and had a depth of 93 miles. Ideal for a short offensive. The Germans expected to break through the Russian lines in the first day, in just a few hours. And once in the open fields beyond, in just a few days, they will reach the town of Kursk. Thus, with their victory, they will have shortened the eastern front lines, and another large chunk of Soviet armies would have been destroyed. But the offensive was already an uneasy gamble. The Germans neither had strategic, operational, nor tactical surprise. And to underscore that fact, a couple of hours before the German assault teams left their trenches, they came under an enormous Soviet artillery barrage. But beyond that fact, at 5:30 hours on July 5th, the German artillery opened fire, and an hour later, their combined arms assault teams left their starting points, confident that they will triumph. Leading the way were the new Tiger and Panther tanks and also big Ferdinand assault guns. Their heavy armor had to absorb Soviet anti-tank fire, and behind them were large groups of medium tanks and infantrymen, and they will destroy any defensive position that tried to stop them. In the northern sector, the 1,200 tanks and assault guns of the 3 Panzer Corps of the 9th Army attacked the Soviet 13th Army. To the south, the 1,500 tanks and assault guns of the 2 Panzer Corps of the 4th Panzer Army and the Panzer Corps of the Army Detachment Kempf pounded the Soviet 6th and 7th Armies. The offensive had begun. But even from the start, the German assault teams met much stronger resistance than expected. Of course, they were aware that Soviet soldiers would not yield easily. But this time, every town, every hill, every clump of trees, they were all strong points. And the German assault teams were not finding room to maneuver. Every attack route was blocked by obstacles, which in turn were covered by fire from every type of weapon. Every assault became a difficult task, and once a strong point was defeated, another was behind, and then another, and another. Therefore, for the first day of the offensive, the Germans failed to achieve the expected breakthrough, and that was totally unexpected. Let us go back a few months. The Soviets knew that the Germans were preparing a new offensive, and that it would fall against Kursk. Therefore, huge amounts of men and material were sent to the area. The northern sector was assigned to the Central Army Front, which had 5 infantry armies in front and 1 tank army and 2 tank corps as reserves. And the southern sector was assigned to the Voronezh Army Front, with 4 infantry armies in front and in reserve an infantry army, a tank army, 2 tank corps, and 1 infantry corps. And in those 2 army fronts, the Soviets had 3,300 tanks and self-propelled guns. But that was not all. The Soviets placed a huge strategic reserve nearby. That was the Steppe Army Front, with 5 mechanized armies, a tank army, and numerous independent army corps. In all, it had 1,830 armored fighting vehicles. In total, the Soviets had 2 million men, 5,130 tanks, and 3,200 planes to face 600,000 Germans, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 planes. Without a doubt, the defenders had a huge mass of troops at Kursk. But beyond that fact, the Soviets now had an ace under their sleeve. And that ace was their new defensive doctrine. From June 1941 to March 1943, of all the factors which led to their massive defeats, the most notable was the Soviet Army's total neglect of their defensive doctrine. But by August 1943, the Soviet General Staff had gathered enough data on their defeats. Their military analysts dove on that data, and out of their conclusions, they created a new defensive doctrine. Each unit had to have a better defensive deployment, better obstacles to disrupt enemy movements, more artillery, more anti-tank weapons, and a better command and control structure. But beyond those improvements, the new Soviet doctrine was defense in depth. In those previous disastrous years, infantry divisions have been deployed in a single echelon, with all leading regiments spread in a 9 to 12 mile line, with only a depth of 1.6 to 3 miles. And against that thin line, the German assault teams easily found and easily created breaches. And then they reached the operational depth of the Soviet armies, where German mechanized units moved with such ease and speed that Soviet commanders were unable to react. They simply were paralyzed, and their defeat was assured. But now, at Kursk, each rifle division had a narrow front, with 2 regiments of a division covering 2.5 to 5.6 miles, with a 3rd regiment in reserve. Now, each division was 3 to 5 miles deep. But that was not all. Each rifle corps had 2 divisions in front, in a first echelon, and a reserve division in a second echelon. Thus, each corps had a depth of 9 to 12 miles. Sure, the divisions in the first echelon had the dangerous task of absorbing the enemy's first blow. But behind that first echelon was the second, and her units had to close any gaps and prevent the enemy from reaching the operational rear. But beyond merely defending their line, corps, armies, and army fronts had orders to counterattack as soon as the German assault teams had been stopped. So units in the second echelon had extra tanks and self-propelled artillery, and groups of engineers with more anti-tank equipment. And all of them had to be used to carry out counterattacks. And when the moment was right, they will be supported by the strategic reserves of armies and fronts. And finally, we have one last note about their new command and control system. Now, at all command levels, artillery and tank units were under the direct control of local commanders, greatly reducing the response time to receive support from those units. And that was a huge improvement to fight against the German assault teams. Roughly speaking, that was the new defensive doctrine of the Soviet General Staff. So, let's get back to the huge German offensive. And first, let's see what happened in the southern sector. On the 5th of July, the assault teams of the 4th Panzer Army struck the positions of the 6th Guards Army. That same day, leading regiments of 2 rifle divisions were defeated. However, for every strong point defeated, the Germans paid a price in men and material. And behind each strong point, there was another, and then another. But the pressure on the line was such that at the end of that first day, the commander of the Soviet Army front, alarmed by the enormous progress of the enemy, sent his tank army and an infantry corps of his reserves into the fight to stop the Germans' advance. That same day, the Panzer Corps of Army Detachment Kampf fell upon a single Soviet rifle division. For the next 3 days, that rifle division fought desperately. But by the evening of the 3rd day, July 7, what was left of that division received orders to withdraw. In the southern sector, by the 3rd day of the battle, several rifle divisions of the 1st echelon had been defeated. But the fallen had bought the necessary time to relocate the Soviet strategic reserves. And now that the axis of the German attack had been determined, the tank army of the Steppe front was called in to reinforce the line. And that order for that unit to reinforce the line was given at the right time, because on the 6th day of the offensive, the panzer units finally pierced the defensive positions of the Soviet rifle divisions. On July 11th, the 7th day of the offensive, the panzer columns were finally advancing across open fields towards the town of Prokhorovka, and there they clashed with the armored units of the 5th Guards Tank Army. 800 Soviet tanks engaged 300 panzers, and in the huge tank battle, the Germans were stopped. That ended any hope of a German operational or strategic victory in the southern sector, and 2 days later, they began to retreat. Now let's see what happened in the northern sector. On the 5th of July, the German assault teams struck the divisions of the 1st echelon of the 13th Army, and by the 7th of July, the 3rd day of the battle, the assault teams had already reached the defensive positions of the divisions in the 2nd echelon. Already, numerous rifle divisions had been defeated. But on the 3rd day of the battle, the commander of that army front finally sent his reserve tank army reinforced by units of the 2nd echelon of Army Corps. Violent fighting continued as German divisions tried to break through the defensive. But all their efforts were in vain, and by July 9th, the 5th day of the offensive, the German advance in the northern sector came to a complete halt. There, in the northern sector, among the remains of the Soviet defensive positions, a first in the fighting between the Soviet and German armed forces had been reached. In 5 days of intensive fighting, at an enormous cost in lives and material, the Soviets had halted the German efforts to achieve an operational breakthrough. But that's not all. On July 12th, in the northern sector, Soviet artillery opened up a huge barrage, announcing the start of a previously planned offensive against the German positions around the city of Orel. And to this, we have to add news on the Western Front. On July 10th, the Western Allies landed in Sicily. So, in order to bolster the defenses in Italy, Hitler decided to withdraw a substantial number of troops from the Eastern Front, eventually marking the end of Operation Citadel. Well, now let us analyze what had happened. And of course, a good part of the German defeat at Kursk was due to the Germans' leadership interference on strategic and operational decisions. In particular, the blind faith in the new generation of tanks, which was thought that would be enough to pierce the Soviet lines. Also, another factor for the German defeat was the Soviet superiority in men and materiel. But by far, the most important factor was the new defensive doctrine coined by the Soviet General Staff. And with that doctrine, they fought at Kursk. But I have to be totally clear. The German combined arms assault teams were still the best. And at the tactical level, several Soviet rifle divisions were defeated. At Kursk, at the tactical level, the new defensive doctrine had failed in several sectors, while at the operational level, the defense was only partially successful. In the north, the defenses held, but in the south, the Soviet line was pierced, while at the strategic level, the Soviet defense in depth was a complete success. For at Prokhorovka, Soviet tanks, with great losses, stopped the German offensive, and then the Soviets launched their two massive counterattacks. And that was the final lesson learned by the Soviets from their previous defeats. Once the initial success of the Germans' assaults wore off, the German forces were left vulnerable to strategic counterattacks. For that reason, in the defensive plan of 1943, the Soviet command had already included two major counteroffensives. The first fell on the northern sector of the German lines on July 12. The second fell against the southern sector on August 3rd. That is how the battles around the town of Kursk announced to the world that no matter how an army conducts offensive operations, there will always be a defensive way that will stop it. And all that is needed to create that new way of fighting is to stop, analyze the information at hand, and with that analysis, find a way to deal with the problem. As simple as that. Well, I hope that you liked this video. Regards, Victor Aguilar-Chang.